Yeah.
So,
Wow.
So the most grammatically correct is John. Luke is. Hey, welcome everybody to live Q&A. This is Pastor and the Recovering Heretic. I'm Pastor Dave.
And I'm Recovering Heretic Dan. Where we're
live.
Yeah, we're live. And as you caught us really geeking out.
Over
Greeking.
Right,
Geeking?
over Greek and the very So anyway, to finish that conversation, so Mark's Greek is awful. I mean, it's clear that somebody who was fluent enough to speak it but couldn't write it to save his life was trying to write it and barely succeeded. he's the best storyteller. But my New Testament professor used to describe Mark as he's that guy from West Virginia who has no education, but he can tell the best stories you've ever heard. That's Mark.
Okay, then that might get into why today's topic is today's topic.
Yep.
Which is off the mark. In that when I read Mark, I see a lot of stuff that I find between the lines that I find very interesting that I don't see in the other synoptic gospels.
Yep.
Mark between the lines has a really different take on a lot of stuff.
Yep.
And given today's reading, when basically Jesus starts the ministry after John gets arrested. And that got me wondering about, in general, it seems like in Mark's gospel, it takes people an extra long time to come around to realizing that maybe Jesus is the Messiah. And in some ways, even Jesus himself,
Yeah.
And so, I mean, the first part of it is just that on the surface of my question. Because even John, the way John behaves, and here, supposedly in the womb, John recognized Jesus was the Messiah, right?
Right,
Like,
Luke.
He kicks around.
Right.
And then in the non-canonical child gospels,
Right.
Jesus kills John accidentally as a kid and then brings him back to life. So you got all this stuff leading up to it. And supposedly at Jesus' baptism, this is my son.
Right.
I'm well pleased. But then John gets arrested and Jesus begins, and we can talk about this too, either taking over John's ministry for him in absentia, while John's in absentia, or starting his own spin-off ministry.
Yeah, it's more our own spin-off, but
So then,
it's not a franchising operation. It's a it's a spin-off.
So John comes, back,
Yeah.
and it's like sending people over. It's like, go check on Jesus. So it's clear John doesn't have any idea Jesus is the one he's supposedly been prophesying about.
Yeah, well, he does, but the question is this... So the central claim of Mark's gospel is that the way of discipleship leads to the cross. And so for Mark, you cannot understand Jesus' messiahship until the crucifixion. It's the crucifixion that reveals Jesus as Messiah. And so until he is crucified, nobody's going to get it. And in fact, until he's... and in fact, Jesus is kind of restrained about it until the crucifixion, because his point is, you won't understand, you'll mistake why this is happening until I am crucified. So don't talk about it too much, because you're not even going to know how to talk about it correctly without the crucifixion.
So this is a really critical theological point for Mark.
Yeah, it's like the crucifixion reveals the messiahship of Jesus Christ. And so you have to understand any of it, you have to understand the cross. The crucifixion narrative in Mark takes up the exact same amount of space as it does in all the other Gospels, but Mark's about 2/3 to half of the size of those. So percentage-wise, the crucifixion takes up far more of Mark's Gospel than it does the other ones.
Yeah.
Which tells you about what Mark... its centrality in understanding who Jesus is for Mark, this is, and for discipleship, this is the path of discipleship, is to go to the cross.
So is that why Mark seems to be the only one that really doesn't emphasize the resurrection?
Yeah.
Like the original Mark is just
He's
Oh,
raised
the
from the
tomb's
dead,
open.
right? Because that's not what proves Jesus is the Messiah. It's the crucifixion
Itself.
itself that makes Jesus the Messiah. That proves that he's the Messiah.
Yeah. And now that seems to go counter to pop theology in that, a lot of people make a big deal about it's the resurrection
Yes.
that makes Christianity Christianity.
Right.
So how does Mark differ in that regard? Why would Mark, basically not saying anything about the resurrection, still, I guess what I'm asking is, how does Mark supplant other people's importance of the resurrection with the importance of the crucifixion?
Yeah.
Because anybody can be crucified.
Yeah, it's it is the willingness. It's two things. It's both the so it's two things. The first thing is Mark's responding to so Mark's written around the same time as the first Jewish war is erupting, kind of in Judea. And so Mark's audience...
And just making that clear, that's the rebellion against Rome actually taking arms.
Right. It's the first Jewish war, it's called. It happens in 66 to 70. 66 to 69, 70 AD. Okay. And so this is where the temple's eventually destroyed and, the city's destroyed and all of Jerusalem's destroyed. So Mark's church, which is somewhere, probably Rome, has two voices they're hearing, probably, and voice one is the recruiters, the Jewish recruiters, right? Which are, we're going to win the war, we're going to reinstitute the kingdom, join up, And on the other hand, they're hearing Rome's propaganda, right? Which is, the empire's undefeated, we will triumph and restore peace through strength of arms, yada, yada, yada.
The Pax Romana shall be restored.
Right, shall be restored. The emperor brings peace and prosperity. So they've got these two voices, which are both decidedly triumphal.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, both the recruiters, we will have victory, and the Romans thing, they're both triumphal unto militarism, unto kill your enemies, and so Mark's audience, the crucifixion is so important for Mark because, one, Mark wants to instill in his community a different way of discipleship that's non-triumphal, and the way to do that is to embrace, Mark's theory is embrace the suffering, It's almost, in some ways, it's almost the opposite of Buddhism, right? It's like, it's not trying to escape the suffering. You're going to willingly enter into it, and through that path, you'll ignore both recruiting voices. You've got both propaganda voices that you're hearing.
Yeah.
And so from that, you get a theology position, which is, this is where it makes a difference, right? Which is, Lutherans call it the theology of the cross, but it's anti-triumphalism. Like, triumphalism kind of wants to say, oh, we'll win, we'll defeat, and if you follow...
It puts it in war terms, it sounds like, too.
Right, war terms and victory terms and onward Christian soldiers and, and kind of all that stuff. And the cross kind of calls all that into question, right? Like, you are not going to be victorious. You are not going to be glorious. You are going to go to the cross. You're going to be, like, the only way to new life is through rejecting glory, and that's where that kind of crucifixion narrative makes a difference.
Yeah. Now, this is a vague memory, so I may be off. But haven't you said that before that it's thought that Peter taught with Mark's gospel?
Yeah, tradition has it that, that Mark is Peter's translator in Rome, and so he's in Rome as he's writing this gospel, and that the stories are sourced to Peter, That's the tradition.
So in a lot of ways, we could conceivably call this the Gospel of Peter.
Yeah, I mean, it's Mark, right? Mark wrote, like Mark put his flourishes
Yeah.
on it. And that's a tradition, and some people will say, well, Peter's always, depicted so poorly in this gospel, and yada, yada, yada. And that always makes it a little more believable to me, because when I tell stories about myself, I'm almost always self-deprecating. Like I could see Peter as bishop in Rome telling nothing but bad stories about himself and the apostles.
Yeah.
We were mess ups and screw ups the whole way through, thanks be to God for our Lord.
Yeah. But that, again, seems to fit the theology of Jesus' message more than glorifying.
Yeah.
To say, I was a mess up,
Right.
but I'm still okay.
I'm still here, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
So does Mark give us a better clue then into what the original apostles would have seen as the theology of Jesus?
I mean, they all give a good picture, right? Paul actually probably gives the best picture because he's earliest, I mean, you actually want, people don't like to hear this, but if you actually want the closest thing to Jesus, it's Paul's letters. It's not the Gospels, But I think Mark gives us a good window into a very early Christianity, and how they kind of saw their movement. So, yeah.
And you mentioned that, and that's part of what got us into the conversation before we thought we were being live, that Mark was probably the least erudite of the writers,
Yes.
to put it kindly.
Yeah.
Does that mean we may have lost some things in translation, that Mark, in using such poor Greek,
Maybe
we may lose stuff?
It's less about, I don't remember huge, like, those kind of things in Mark. He does things like he'll transliterate Hebrew words just into Greek. Like, he won't translate them. He'll just
plop them in.
Just wholesale transliterate them. Like, so you're coming along, you're like, what the heck is that word? And it's like, oh, it's actually a Jewish word. He
spelled it out in Greek.
He spelled it out in Greek, and he'll do things like that. Like, he doesn't follow the grammatical rules very well. His grammar's kind of all over the place. Like, he'll use Hebrew grammar with Greek words, which is even really weirder, occasionally. Like, you're like, wait, what? Or Aramaic grammar with Greek words. He doesn't have a command of the language the way some of the other authors do.
Yeah.
But he's a great storyteller. So
Yeah. Although in context it makes sense, right? Because wasn't Greek pretty much the lingua franca of the Mediterranean?
yeah, especially the eastern half.
Yeah.
So yes.
So he would have spoken it for trade purposes and things like that.
Right, and
but not had to have had the grammar down.
Right, he probably never had to have the grammar down. Right, right, and so, that's fine. It's just it is who he is. So.
Well, you mentioned then that it's good odds that Paul captures the spirit of the original Christianity of Jesus.
Yeah.
The best. So given that, I did have a question with today's reading where Paul's talking about the looming nature of everything.
Yeah.
Paul is very much, he's an absolutist in a lot of ways. He reminds me in those regards of reading how everybody lived in Acts of the Apostles.
Yes.
So I get back to, should we as Christians be living more absolutely?
Yeah.
Or in some ways, did we get lazy? Did Christianity kind of come to an end in the 300s and this new Christianity that we have today happen?
Yeah.
I mean, I get the fact that you can't live as if you're not even married anymore because it's coming tomorrow.
Yeah.
But he is pretty strident in a lot of these things.
How to put So I guess Paul sounds different to different congregations, right? So part of this is the Corinthians need him to sound this way. Corinth has got a lot of problems, and they need a bit of absolute.
They need the ruler across the palm of the
Yeah,
hand.
they need a bit of absolute in their lives. They have messed up in many and various ways up to this point. And they are this perennially troubled congregation. So, so it's understandable that he's speaking this way to them. If you read the pastoral letters or something like that, the other letters, Paul's much more. He's a little bit more compromising.
There's more of a chill factor.
Yeah, and even as he's sorting out, we take these snippets, which sounds very absolute, right? But in this same letter in Corinthians and in Romans, Paul goes over this very in-depth ethical debate about do we eat meat or not, and he's not he doesn't create a rule that's like yes or no to one or the other in absolute terms. He creates this rule, which is you got to consider what your neighbor needs is what he comes down as.
Yeah.
Then if your neighbor needs you not to eat meat, then yeah, you do it, but it's what your neighbor needs, not what you need.
Yeah.
And it's a hard rule, but it's not an absolute kind of thing.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I think Christianity at its best is always expecting Jesus to return tomorrow. Mm-hmm. Even if he doesn't, we kind of live as if we expect to. And there are days we do that really well. And there are days when we don't do that very well. And it kind of depends on the day, right? When this congregation said, we're just going to give up our primary worship space for another congregation. That's that kind of absolutist, we're living as, if Jesus came back tomorrow, I'd rather be able to say, well, we did the right thing for this congregation that had a church fire.
Yeah.
And that's living like he's coming back tomorrow, even if he obviously didn't. It's been several months later, you know, but that's living like it. So we're good at it some days, and some days we're bad at it. It's true for everybody.
Yeah. Just try to self-correct when you can.
Right. And you always get a new day. Right?
Yeah.
So,
thankfully. We're almost out of time, so I want to just jump back to one last thing from today's reading. It's going to the Old Testament.
Yeah.
And are we supposed to take Jonah seriously? I ask that because there's a lot of ways that Jonah seems like the comic relief of the Old Testament. It's very sitcom-y.
Yeah.
What happens to Jonah, how he reacts.
Yeah, it's great.
It's like we're out there, save the world. Oh, wait, but don't keep smiting them.
Yeah, keep smiting them.
And now that you haven't smitten them, smite me, because I just can't live with the fact that you forgave people.
He's very I want to die. It's
over dramatic, over the top.
Like,
it is very sitcom-y.
Yeah.
So do we think there was an actual Jonah, or was it actually written as fiction to be a little more lighthearted in the approach to the lesson?
A lot of scholars would tell you it's a comedy. Because I would probably place it in the category of historical fiction. I think there might have been a real Jonah, but the book itself is written as a historical fiction comedy about a character, and like all good comedy, it's funny, but there's a bite of truth underneath it that is hard to hear, so it makes us laugh is because we're like, oh man, that said or revealed something none of us wanted to say out loud,
Yeah. The old line, it's funny because it's true.
Right, it's funny because it's true, and so, there's my favorite scholar, Walter Brueggemann, divides the Old Testament into what he calls the prime core testimony of Israel of who God is. And then he says the Old Testament's like a court case trying to decide who this God of Israel is. Well, it might be a little more complicated. Than maybe you're positing it. then maybe you're thinking. So Jonah's one of those things where it's like, well, God is irrevocably on Israel's side, and Israel's enemies are God's enemies. Often true, But then comes this book called Jonah, which is about this prophet who's sent to grade A Israelite enemy, and God ends up forgiving them and kind of saying, the book ends on this great question. We didn't end here, but the book ends on this question where God says, should I not be concerned about that great city of 120,000 people that don't know their left hand from their right? And there's like, should I not be concerned is kind of the counter testimony question. It's like, don't you think God is also concerned with Nineveh, even though it's grade A enemy, So it's a comedy. You are supposed to laugh at it. It's funny. Funny enough, Jewish tradition reads Jonah on Yom Kippur. I didn't say this in my sermon, but the entire book of Jonah is the assigned reading on the Day of Atonement.
Oh, fascinating.
Yeah. And so, that should tell us something about the point of the book, right? That it's meant to kind of call our certainties about forgiveness and who is forgiven and who isn't into question just a little bit, and we laugh at it, but we laugh because it makes it uncomfortable that it's like, yeah, we're all kind of Jonah.
Yeah. To say that lesson's still very applicable.
Yeah, right. We're all kind of certain God forgives me, but not thee, and God kind of says, why are you angry?
Don't be so sure.
Right. Shouldn't I be concerned with them too? We should hear that ringing in our ears.
Wow.
Yeah.
And that's a good ringing to end with.
Yep.
So thank you again.
You're welcome.
And just a reminder, we'll be back next week, right?
I think we are. Probably. Yeah, sure. We'll say
Okay.
so. If we're not, you'll figure
we'll
it out.
get the council president to make a ruling. Well, next week is going to be the 28th, so no.
Okay.
All right, good. Then join us next week.
Join us next
We've
week.
decided we're going to be here. So.
Right. All right.
You too.
See ya.